welcome, and over to you to begin.
Alrighty, and thanks for the intro as well. Yeah, David basically said it. So what I'll do is just give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering generally. I suppose just a basic overview of the project, why it started, what the reasons for it were in terms of enabling more pathways and better pathways towards existing student supports. We'll kind of go through, I suppose, the key questions around the student experience that we were essentially trying to answer in terms of, what is engagement? What does it look like? How do we enable and foster it, et cetera? How we've used analytics to actually help with that. And some of, I suppose, our main insights that we've pulled out, because we've plenty, but some are more relevant and useful than others. So we'll aim more towards that side, and then just a quick summary. And if anyone has any questions at the end, happy to dedicate plenty of time to that as well. So basically, so this project was initially piloted in the School of Vet in 2018, really small cohort to start, 40 odd students. And the idea really essentially was that, a lot of the time when students are at risk of disengagement, they've had some other pressure issue in another area of their life, or maybe students, maybe their studies are too much for them, or again, a plurality of reasons. That's kind of when they're least able to actually reach out and avail of existing institutional supports that are there. So we were looking to build ways to get more of a, I suppose, real-time visibility of this based off of the data that we had. And from there, we've grown and scaled. So moved up to be all of the year one programs in the School of Vet. And then this past year, we rolled out to the College of Science as well for their stage one there. So, going from 40-ish to, around 1,500. So, it means we're doing something right at least, but that's kind of the context in which we're operating. And exactly. So the idea essentially would be that based off of the data that we can see from students, that we're enabling more pathways to student advisors specifically. A lot of this ties in as well with existing learning within UCD, particularly around the trusted persons, findability of services work that Agile were doing a few years ago, essentially showing that students, in general, they don't really care too much if supports are signposted for them. What matters to them is that they know of a trusted person that they can reach out to if they do experience something. And then depending on the domain of that experience, then they could, get relevant trusted support. So we really tried to focus this to be a, how do we enable those pathways to the trusted person, if that makes any sense. So in terms of what we looked at in terms of our engagement model, so there's a lot of different stuff out there, even around what student engagement is. Is it wholly the classroom, or is it the entire student experience? Is it extracurricular activity, things like that? So what we looked at it is we took an approach where there are key different facets of engagement. So for instance, how students might understand and relate to their course, how they interact with people in their course. All of these things can affect their level of engagement in their study. But it can be quite difficult, for example, to measure social engagement. You can't really be like, oh, okay, well, how many friends does John have? How engaged is he in the clubs and societies there? Particularly when, on the one hand, it shouldn't matter in a sense. Students have that autonomy. But one thing that I guess is handy is that each of these different facets of engagement can result in a behavioral change, in that a student engages more with their course or less. So we were like, okay, well, if we can find a pathway into looking at how a student is engaging with their course via the virtual learning environment, then this will at least let us start a conversation, at which point we can then see, oh, is there an aspect, say, from outside their course that is impacting their course, or whether it's internal or that sort of thing. So I guess we recognize the plurality of different ways that students can engage, and just tried to find pathways to look at that. So yeah, this is, I touched on this earlier, that kind of the first year experience kind of frameworks that UCD has in place already. The idea being that, you throw a whole lot at first year specifically initially, and that first year, it can be obviously an undergrad, but there's a large amount of graduate students as well, that this is their first exposure to the university, is at a graduate level. So it is kind of ongoing throughout the cycle of student life. But again, obviously recognizing that transitioning into a third level and graduate learning environment, has both internal and external challenges. So it's just trying to find ways to ensure that that pathway of support is used. So that kind of asks us that, bring us to the question of, so why are we focusing on the virtual learning environment? Because like I said, there are other pathways there. So, I mean, besides the fact that that's what we got funding for, the reason why we focused on VLEs broadly is that if you just look at this chart in the middle, it's just looking at stage 1 for vet and the different programs that are there. So the blue lines are what virtual, the amount of material that was on the virtual learning environment in Brightspace in 2019/20. And so that was a year where the first trimester was face-to-face. And then after that, halfway through, obviously COVID happened, so it all went virtual. The following academic year was wholly virtual. So you can see there's this huge spike in the content that was there because people had to use it, right? But now that we've moved back to a face-to-face experience for this current academic year, we can see that we're still asking students to do more than we were before the pandemic. And that's even including that year where they were half online anyway. So whether it's that we're asking people to do more, or whether it's that we're actually using the tools that are there more, whether it's a net positive or it's just a kind of a hangover from COVID, either way, it does show that it's a relevant avenue to be looking at student data, because there's so much more happening there than there used to be. So just looking at some of the challenges that come with this, though, is that given that we are using the virtual environment more, there are fewer opportunities for face-to-face contact. So if you're a student advisor or module coordinator or program director, and you would typically be like, okay, well, I have a good sense based off of what students are in my classroom, or who's in the hallway, or what my virtual or face-to-face office hours are, that you have a sense of how engaged students are with your program, and if there tends to be any changes there, you can pick up on them. But you just don't necessarily have that that insight when it's all virtual. So it just means we have to build more virtual pathways to the advisor. And I suppose the last thing I might touch on in terms of a challenge that we're hoping to bridge here is you have this issue where I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Brightspace and how things look there, and a lot of the reporting that is available seems to be tailored for module coordinators specifically. So you can, if you're a module coordinator, you have a great sense of who's in your module, what content people are accessing, how much time they're spending in their content, all those things. But you as a module coordinator aren't necessarily a pastoral support for student well-being, in the sense that where you're more sort of a subject matter expert in a sense. There's the student advisors and other supports university fill that role, but the analytics infrastructure in Brightspace doesn't really feed a whole lot of that to advisors, and the kind of granular module level content isn't super relevant to advisors either. If I'm in the School of Vet, for example, and the advisor there doesn't really care if I'm a straight A student looking at all my material, or if I'm a straight C. If I'm happy and engaged, then that's all that matters, essentially. So there's a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the reporting material that's available to advisors versus what they need. So we tried to bridge that gap to some degree. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, just because I feel like I've covered most of it already. But essentially, what we're looking to do is, again, just find ways to optimize the virtual learning environment as a pathway to enable more interventions by the advisor. And based off of how more hybrid and blended third level is going, we have more of a need to do this. So in terms of our actual insights and what we've learned, if that makes any sense. So in terms of how we flag students to the advisor, there's two criteria we look at specifically. One is whether a student has logged into their module or not for the last 7 days. So we would look at every single module students enrolled in their program. If they've logged into the majority of modules in their program, they wouldn't be flagged. But if they haven't logged in for the majority of modules, then they would. So the reason we have this as one of our criteria is it captures the profile of students that might have been quite engaged at some stage during the year. So if you're looking at metrics like, for instance, the total topic students are accessing or anything like that, you wouldn't necessarily catch that disengagement. Whereas if you can just see in real time, oh, John Wyatt, the student, hasn't actually logged into Brightspace for 2 weeks or 1 week, that there might be something going on there, and that prompts a conversation for that sudden drop off. So the second criteria we look at is a little more nuanced. We look at the total topic access that students have compared to their peers. And this is important because there's so much variance module by module and program by program. You have some programs where there's only 20 or 30 topics in Brightspace, and you have some where there might be 500 different learning materials in Brightspace. So you can't necessarily set an absolute threshold in terms of, oh, well, have they accessed 50 topics or not? It's just, there's too much variance. And even things like so for instance, David might be teaching a module and he has it organized week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and there's relevant material for each. Whereas I might go, oh, learning topic A, learning topic B, learning topic C. And one of us might focus on secondary sources where someone else might look at discussion board material. So just based on the wide variety of content that is available, what we're looking at is that relative aspect compared to peers. So if you kind of look at all these lovely dots on this scatter plot here, the blue line is the average trend line of students, and the red line would be the threshold of if it's less than 30% of the peer average. So if you're one of the dots below that red trend line, and that's across the majority of your modules, then we'd check in with you. Anyone else, it's like, no, we're happy that you're looking at enough material consistently enough that you're engaged, but the ones that are kind of long-term, not quite in their program, those are the ones we're trying to catch as well. So combining those two criteria together, those are the main ones that we look at. So you can ignore most of this in a sense. But I think the two main things to really pull out of our process map of how we pull this into a report for advisors is we combine everything to get that program level baseline for students. So again, it filters out some of that module noise, and we essentially make a decision: is that student above or below a certain risk threshold? And if the answer is yes, they get put into a report for the advisor. And I suppose the second important thing to really look at here is that advisors do still have discretion when it comes to if the student is flagged to them. So in a given week, there might be, say, 10 students that are flagged to an advisor for a specific program. Again, it's variable depending on the time of year and things like that. But the advisor might go, oh, I know that John has already been flagged to me via another means. I know there was a bereavement recently, or he had COVID recently. So there's already something in place. I don't need to reach out because this status essentially telling me what I already know. Whereas it might be, oh, this is news to me. I haven't even noticed this student before, and now suddenly they're popping up in the report. Then yes, I should probably reach out and get in touch with the student. So that essentially starts that intervention. And in general, those interventions are quite light touch in nature. It is this kind of a, hey, John, how are you getting on? Is everything okay? Email or WhatsApp, as opposed to something like, oh, I've noticed you've missed everything. How dare you? Like, it's not that kind of, it's not it's not a disciplinary thing. It is, like I said, very light touch and just trying to encourage that pathway into using a support. So I suppose the next big question that really comes up is, are we actually identifying disengagement based off of these criteria that we use in Brightspace? And the short answer is yes. Again, there's a lot of noise in this chart here, but the main thing to look at is that based off of the students that are flagged, which are the red columns across every program that we look at over the last couple of years, they invariably, again, on average for the program, have lower GPA outcomes than students that aren't flagged at all. So it means that we definitely are targeting the correct students, if that makes any sense. We're identifying, and again, this is great because this isn't a, oh, we found out at exam time that this student isn't engaged because they didn't show up. This is we are finding out week by week that this student is at risk for something. So it's a nice real-time snapshot, which is really promising. And again, invariably, it does seem we're targeting the right ones. What's a bit of a frustrating thing or a shame, though, is that in a perfect world, you would hope that identifying the student and having an intervention means that there's no difference if everything's perfect, right, in terms of outcome for GPA. So you might necessarily think, okay, well, if the intervention is perfect, it should be the same as a student that wasn't flagged at all. So measuring how effective our intervention is has been a little trickier. But we do have, for science specifically, we're a subset of students that would have had their program outside of the College of Science. So for instance, an arts and humanities student doing an elective, or College of Business, something like that, where it's an elective credit as opposed to a course. So they weren't quite covered in the pilot, but we could see that they would have been flagged based off of their engagement footprint. So if you look at this chart, the blue is the same. There's students that weren't flagged and they had the highest GPA outcomes, right? Which is good in a sense. But we can see that the students that were within the LEAP umbrella, where we flagged them and we were able to intervene, had higher outcomes in terms of GPA than students that were not able to avail of the same pathway to support. So it's a promising sign that, yeah, we can't get it perfect, but at least our impact is more positive than if we weren't doing anything. So it's a subset of the broader student cohort, but again, some positives anyway. And I guess this is the last thing to look at, really, from a pure quant standpoint in terms of looking at our impact is the GPA isn't necessarily the be all end all of student performance as well, because again, it's in a sense, if they're perfectly engaged and happy, it shouldn't really matter what their GPA is. But looking in terms of progression for students, if you kind of look just really broadly at pass-fail data, you get essentially the same thing, where we can see that just again, broadly speaking, that students that weren't flagged and also those that were able to avail LEAP support had slightly better outcomes than those that didn't have those pathways. So again, it does show, again, it's not perfect, but it does show that real-time intervention pathway does have some knock-on positive impact, at least. So the next question, I suppose, that we would ask ourselves is, yeah, great, we have decent quant data that we're having a positive impact, but what do students actually think about this? How do they feel about having their data used in this specific way? How do they feel about these interventions taking place? Did you think it's broadly positive or not? So we tried to ask students consistently year on year, just for some feedback around interventions, to see if they are happy that this is a relevant support pathway for them. And it does seem, broadly speaking, the main themes that we could pull out, firstly, with regards to the importance of student advisors, the feedback is so kind of universally positive towards them in that respect. So it's great that we are using them as a pathway of support for students. You can see, look, they're amazing, they're wonderful, they help my personal growth. There's so much positive feedback for them. So the fact that this pathway just enables more contact with the advisor is probably a lot in itself, if that makes any sense, is just how valuable that support is. So if you're an advisor on this call, it's a great endorsement for you. And in terms of early warning interventions, it does seem to be that students are quite happy for us to reach out, and that even if it's not necessarily relevant for them, they appreciate that that network is there for their peers as well, just to make sure that, again, that the pathway is there. So the last bit of qualitative feedback that we've done around the project was asking as well what advisors think in terms of how useful they find this tool as well, because if we might have a brilliant tool, but if it's not useful for them, it's not necessarily going to be used. So in terms of positives, I think coming out of the pandemic, I think they've learned that virtual attendance is just as important as face-to-face in some ways, that it's as relevant a form of engagement, I should say, and that they were happy enough that they could still actually fulfill their roles to some degree in virtual spaces, as opposed to needing a face-to-face environment for intervening with students. So that was a major positive to hear. And then there's the however, right, that they do at the same time would prefer that there is some face-to-face contact available, because it's not replicable in some senses. So obviously, if we can get, if we can have both, that's the perfect world. But again, it's a nice to have, I suppose, having the blended virtual pathways as well. So one or two quick things before kind of wrapping up, and for kind of before Q&A and summary, is, I guess, what about an assessment, right? So the reason why we looked at this was we were trying to figure out if things like, for instance, having a midterm quiz or something like that and seeing a student result based off of that would be something we could incorporate into a pathway for academic advisors, in that, like, oh, well, I noticed that, or whether, say, for instance, the advisor follows up with every student that failed a midterm assessment, something like that. Is that a potential pathway for looking at addressing disengagement? And the short answer is not really, that we found, because it does seem that assessment seems to be fairly range bound based off of the type of assessment that it is, if that makes any sense. So if you're looking at giving students continuous assessment, you're generally going to get quite high GPA outcomes, whereas if you're looking at things like MCQs, you're going to get lower ones. So regardless of what the student's engagement looks like, they're going to fall on a certain GPA threshold based off of the type of assessment that's there. And there's even things like, say, for instance, group projects gives us a lot of noise there as well, in terms of that's not reflective of their engagement to some sense as well. And obviously it's building graduate competencies and things like that, but it's just while it's interesting data, it wasn't really useful for us in terms of trying to find out, is a student disengaging in real time? So just, again, a consideration if you're looking at setting up similar things in your area. So just to summarize, so this is as I said, the broad strokes of this presentation, right? So one thing we did, I guess, acknowledge is that engagement is multidimensional. So there's a lot of things that can affect whether a student's engaged in a program or not, outside of what's actually happening on their course. But VLE data is a key pathway for helping identify this real-time disengagement when it happens, and allowing us to intervene in a way that we would not be able to otherwise until, say, the end of term, just based off of traditional support pathways. So, and that's great as well, because there's so many supports in the university for students, and there are resources that are provided by the university, and they would love to be utilized also, and utilized in as useful a fashion as possible. So it's a nice finding there. We could see that analytics was, broadly speaking, predictive in terms of looking at program level engagement, which is nice, because it wasn't really an existing pathway or reporting that was available before we use it in the project. And also that we can just generally, our impact based off of that is positive. And it's not really listed here, but one thing we are hoping to do for this coming academic year is embed and scale our reporting once the project is finished, so that this way we're able to find the most useful things, roll them out to other areas, and just mean that that reporting is more automated for everyone as a useful tool and pathway for them to use. So depending on how we do it, that kind of avenue isn't quite settled there yet. But again, the hope is that we'd be able to broaden our scope even more for the coming academic year. Again, I know this is being recorded, so this is really just if anyone's going back over it, if they want to look at any of the research that underpinned a lot of our approach. And again, just if you want to get in touch with anyone specifically with the project as well, there's our email info there as well. And that's it. So I know we have the hour, but broadly speaking, at a lot of these sessions, the Q&A does tend to, I suppose, be almost as long as the presentation for some people. So happy to give as much time to your questions as you have, depending on your area of interest. And again, thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you very much, John. That's excellent. That's really interesting. I have lots of questions, but I shan't hinder you just yet. I'll open the floor. I'm going to stop the recording. So the session is being recorded. So if you missed the beginning, apologies, but it is being recorded. You can catch up hopefully after. Are there any questions? Anthony, yes.